Resume. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Dwarf Fortress. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a bunch of different things. I'm going to talk about humans and patterns and how we're sort of biologically compelled to make patterns out of stuff that isn't actually meaningful. I'm going to talk a bit about how that might impact stories in games and stories from games. And I'm going to talk about what is Dwarf Fortress, because I'm sure there's people here who've never heard of it and don't know what it is. And then I'm going to round up with some of the keys to what makes a good story generator rather than a good story in a game. Okay, so there's some big words here. So human beings are biologically constructed things with lots of neurons and a visual cortex, and we look at things and we interpret things, and we listen to things and we interpret those things. And we have a couple of tendencies that make just bare reality actually much more fun. So we see faces everywhere. This is called pareidolia in psychology. We see faces in a coconut, or if we look at my previous slide, a lovely doggo in a piece of wood. And so that sort of drives us to sort of reinterpret the world around us in terms of humanness and see human things in other things. And that doesn't just tie to faces, it ties to a whole lot of other things. And I'll come back to that later when I talk a bit about empathy. So we also have a tendency to create conspiracies and stories out of nothing. Yeah, we do see one thing happening after another and go, this is all happening to me, and therefore it's part of my story, and so it must be meaningful. And it isn't. It's just one thing happening after another. And even more so when we then tell somebody else. So here's the trick of it, that we take in lots of information and parse it moment to moment and turn it into an internal dialogue that we then might turn into a story that we tell someone else. There's a bunch of folks who sort of talk about this idea, but apophenia is this tendency to see patterns of behavior and patterns of conspiracy all around us and think that it's a part of a story that's directed at us. Obviously, when it becomes mentally unhealthy, that we might talk about that being paranoia or other kind of delusional behaviors. So reality is just a bunch of stuff happening, and stories are humans' way of chunking that down into a way that we can retell it to ourselves and retell it to other people. I think, I mean, it's very obvious whenever you have been in a situation with somebody else and they tell that, you hear them telling the story of that situation, you go, oh, they saw very different things to me. They've picked up a very different story that's all about them in that. So that's what I want you to bear in mind as I'm talking about a bunch of this stuff, because I think that becomes really important when we talk about games. All right, so games have a very complicated and interesting relationship with stories. I think a lot of games have a very structured, authored, passive story that's being delivered throughout the game, but is delivered in these chunks in between the action. So there's, particularly in the early noughties, there was a very strong game studies tendency to talk about the game and the story as separate entities. And then a bunch of people sort of started to pick away at that and go, well, actually the fiction is inside the game bits as well, and this should map through it. So we sort of got into this idea of cutscenes or story being delivered in between the action where the player's in control, and you get sort of weird things like games No, I've forgotten his name. Nathan Drake game, Uncharted. It never works. That connection never works in my brain. In the Uncharted games, Nathan Drake in the cutscenes is a lovely, nice guy who is charming and all of these things. In play, he's a psychopath. He is a murderer who will gun people down without knowing anything about them, because that's what the game design makes you do. Those are the actions. Those are the active verbs you have in the game is hunker down, crawl around, shoot people. That's all the verbs you've got to play with to tell the story in the blue bits in my diagram, in the in-between. And so you sort of get this weird like disjunction between those two things, and there's a bunch of literature about this stuff, so I'm not going to play on it too much. But stories in levels then become this way of delivering story at either end usually, or maybe there's a point where you're locked out of controlling the character in the middle of the level and it delivers something. So there's a level design goal there, and also you want to create this sense of space and sense of exploration, but you also want to then make sure your bits of important story get delivered. So you have a path that you have directed the player towards through the level, which is often referred to as the golden path, that then you cluster the story around that golden path. And if you played any of the games like Titanfall or Last of Us, if you wander away from the main path, there's interesting stuff to interact with, but there isn't any story. Yeah, so you sort of, as long as you're on the kind of core set of encounters, you'll encounter the story. As soon as you wander off, you're sort of forging your own way and exploring the world, but you're no longer encountering authored story, no longer encountering letters, you're no longer encountering pieces of information that designers think are important. Now, the designers might choose to hide stuff away around the edges that give you a different interpretation, and some games do that. And certainly in the Portal games, there's a bunch of like hidden spaces that are backstage that allow you to find stuff. But there's the dissonance between story and gameplay story, the story we might tell as players after we've played the game, because we might be telling the bit about, actually, I wandered off and explored the hut over there, or explored behind, and suddenly the story for us has become different, and the story we might tell others has become different. And this is sort of heading in the direction of this idea of emergent stories, but also my key placeholder here was the game Unpacking, which is the bottom screenshot. And Unpacking doesn't tell you a story. It gets you to do a bunch of stuff. And as you're unpacking this character's life, and it is another character, and they have a life, and you're glimpsing it through unpacking their stuff and putting it away as they move at key points in their life, you discover things about that character. You discover who that character is. And I've left the bathroom in the first shared house there just because it's got a nice twist in it for anyone who's played the game. But you discover stuff about this character and realize who they are through just moving tiny little pixel images around a screen and putting them away and tidying up. And that tells a story about their life, and it has a happy ending, hooray. But it doesn't explicitly have a character on screen. It doesn't explicitly have any dialogue. It doesn't explicitly tell you who that person is. It is entirely down to your interpretation, but it's fairly unambiguous, even through those very simple actions. So I would say Unpacking is right on that edge of clearly being authored, clearly having a structure, and clearly having an emergent experience that comes out of the game play. Okay, so I've been mostly talking about story in games, and now I'm going to talk about story from games. So games like Civilization, games like grand strategy games, games like Europa Universalis 3, 4, whatever, give you the opportunity to take a historical setting or a historical set of stereotypes, and play with them and create an alternative history. And that's all done through your response to the game, your play of the game. And the story emerges or doesn't emerge from play. And I would suggest that games like Civilization particularly have a structure based on the fact that it's based on a very deterministic idea of technology and progress. But that structure leaves loads of space for players to generate actions and do things, be bad guys or good guys, warmongers or peacemongers. And if you talk to somebody about their game of Civ, they will tell you a story about what they did. Oh, at that point, the Mongols were really annoying me, so I started a war with them to take back one of my cities that they stole from me 200 years ago. And it's very kind of personal story, but it's entirely emerging from the systems and mechanics of the game. These kinds of story generator games have existed for a long time, but have this capacity also for replayability. So I've played Civilization in every incarnation, and I've played it multiple times, because every time the story is slightly different and the experience is slightly different, because it's situational and comes out of a bunch of complex systems linking together. And this is where what I think is important about Dwarf Fortress comes in, one of the things. So Dwarf Fortress, what's Dwarf Fortress? So Dwarf Fortress is a video game. It was started in development in about 2004 and released to the public for free in 2006. Its original incarnation, and its incarnation for most of the last 15 years, has been this sort of top image, which is all of the graphics are these ASCII text objects. So these are all created with the American Standard character set and different colors to give you some kind of map of what's going on in the world. The game world is usually quite massive, and you play in a little chunk of it, but your little chunk is made up of a whole load of layers, a little bit like Minecraft, but a lot more crunchy, and you're dealing with a lot of other things going on. So in January 2023, so January this year, Tarn and the group who sort of formed around him released the game as a completed thing on Steam with graphics. So the prettier version is available for purchase on Steam and other platforms, and about 17 million people bought it. So this is a game that's nearly 20 years old. This is a game that's still available for free in the not pretty version, and yet people went out and bought it, and lots of people went out and bought it. And one of the reasons I think that is if you go and Google Dwarf Fortress, you'll see that there are literally thousands and thousands of blogs and shared story groups where people put up stories about how their Dwarf Fortress came to its terrible end. And I think it's important that most of the stories are the end of a dwarf fortress, the last days of something terrible happens and the dwarves die. So people will play this game for 100 hours, but the bit that they record and share with other people is how they fail in playing the game and tell the story of the last few dwarves who cling on and die in the sort of ruins of the space. So Dwarf Fortress starts off, and you create a world and you get a whole bunch of settings, and the game will generate a sort of back history of the world. And in that back history, it creates the map. It creates a bunch of civilizations: humans, dwarves, elves, goblins. There's a couple of others. I think I encountered some deer men recently, and weirdly came to my Dwarf Fortress to listen to some poetry in the tavern. So yeah, I don't know, our famous poets has gone very far. Anyway, so all of this is generated as sort of text. So everything that's happening in the game world beforehand and later on is being recorded in a text log. And this becomes important as we go through. So there is already a bunch of lore and a bunch of history and a bunch of really stupidly named groups. So we've got here the human Leber Tapper scaled of the Confederation of Mountains defeats a bronze colossus at the elf drink metal helps, etc., etc. So you get all of these weird names for things. You get weird names for your settlement. You get weird names for your people. So the dwarves all get named by the system, although I think you can rename them at certain points. Or give them like additional nicknames and things. So all of this happens beforehand and it generates a world. And part of the thing that's important about the world that it generates is the landscape, and part of it is this history, and part of it is that you've got a bunch of settlements dotted around, some of which you know about as the player. So when you choose where to settle, you've got a fair idea how close you are to other dwarf fortresses, how close you are to human civilization, how close you are to the much hated elves. Although recently, you know, my opinions have been changed with they do like poetry. So, you know, hey. All right. And then you arrive in the game world with your broken down wagon and your bunch of dwarves and their pet animals. So dwarves love pets, much to my chagrin sometimes. There are a number of stories on the archive of dwarf fortresses where the dwarves have adopted too many cats, and then the cats have eaten all the food, and then the dwarves starve to death because they've got no food and are surrounded by hundreds of cats that then start eating the dwarves. So yeah, that was a weird failure. I mean, you know, there's tales in the archive of dwarves defeated by tribes of elephants. So, you know, there's some pretty weird stuff that happens in Dwarf Fortress. Anyway, you arrive somewhere with your bunch of belongings, tools and equipment, a bunch of dwarves with a range of skills, and a bunch of animals, some of which are pets, some of them might be useful. Sadly, I would say from the screenshot that we're looking at of Helm's Clam, which is this settlement, almost all of the large animals that I put out to pasture later died, because there's a giant, unbeknown to me when I chose this place to settle the Dwarf Fortress, there's a giant peregrine falcon here that then carries off various animals throughout the time that I've been playing this, the 2 or 3 years of the first settlement of Helm's Clam. Anyway, so you start with 7 dwarves and you dig some tunnels into the ground. So this is a little bit further into the settlement. So we've dug out a space. We've created a dining hall and drinking hall, a place for the dwarves to meet and tell stories and eat and drink. You need to set up somewhere to brew beer, because dwarves will not survive if they don't have drink. And it's got to be some sort of alcoholic beverage, ideally. And you need to farm some underground mushrooms for food and for brewing, and you need to do a bunch of other things, provide them with bedrooms and places to stay, and later on you need to build offices and various other things and storage space to keep them going. So a lot of the gameplay is sort of managing all of these interlocking complex systems of crafting and construction and building furniture and providing for the needs of the dwarves. So each dwarf, each animal as well as each dwarf has a complex set of information about them. So you can read up the backstory of various characters, including this stray cat, who has a whole description of their personality and how they've behaved recently. So this is generated through how they've behaved in the game world, but also kind of gives you some hints to the underlying stats of the character. you have a bunch of skills for a you have the same for a dwarf and a bunch of skills. This particular dwarf, I think, oh, this is my depressive fisher dwarf, isn't it? This dwarf has anxiety and depression, and works as a fisher person, and has a tendency to nervously bite her nails when she's got nothing better to do. So she is quite a difficult character, and as we can see down here, they're having a bad day and their mood is dropping. Yes, they proved to be quite a tricky person, and had a bit of a break at one point, and I had to send out some other dwarves to go and rescue them to make sure that they were all right, because they were having such a bad day. They'd wandered off and sat on the mountainside and forgotten to eat. Terrible things happen to your dwarves, so you need to build tombs to celebrate their lives and keep their memory. Now, keeping their memory is important. As I said before, the game records everything that happens to our dwarves, and we can see from the previous slide where we were only, a couple of slides back, we started out with 7 dwarves. By the time I'm taking screenshots now, we've got 86 dwarves living in the community, and some of them have died in horrible accidents. Some of them have I think some of them got hit. 2 of them got hit by a tree that someone else was felling because they weren't watching out. Health and safety amongst dwarves is not great. So all of this is recorded somewhere. Now, if you provide your community of dwarves with a record keeper and paper, the dwarves will start writing a history of their community. If you tell the dwarves to engrave and decorate a space, they will carve scenes from the history of their place and the past history onto the walls of the space. They will carve, when you get them to build statues, they will build statues of particular things. So this is a well-crafted statue of a dwarf by a particular craftsperson in our community. In other places, I've had dwarves create a mural on the wall of a tavern, which is made up of scenes of, I think there was one in Helmsclam, which involved an image of one of the horses getting eaten by a giant peregrine. So the dwarves keep track of their own history and create art based on it. So this is important, and I'll come back to why I think it's important later. And obviously, the better you build your community, the more jealous the terrible forces in the world are, and eventually somebody will turn up to try and take your rich dwarven halls off you. If you haven't already dug too deeply and too greedily and unleashed something terrible from the depths, you might encounter a goblin army like this one, or be ambushed by jealous elves, or possibly even be trampled to death by an angry swarm of elephants. All of these things have happened in games of Dwarf Fortress, believe me. But always you're given these options to interact with these complex systems. You hopefully have built up a militia of dwarves who are going to be able to fight back using the weapons that they've made in their forges deep in the underground of their fortress. Or not, maybe you were too busy trying to make sure they'd got food to eat, or managing the cat problem, and you've completely forgotten to do anything about training your militia, and now the goblins have turned up and they want all your stuff. So you can see there, the game is made up of a whole bunch of interlocking complex systems and crafting mechanisms that you are getting the players to engage with. I think that's the beauty of this game, and even in its early incarnations, it had a bunch of that complexity. So from the first 2 years of development, so after release, Tarn Adams was working as a postgraduate maths researcher at American University, and they funded themselves on the development. So from 2006 to 2008, he'd sort of worked for a year as a postgraduate, and then postdoctoral researcher, and then like a saved a bunch. I think he said he'd saved $10,000, and he was like, I've got $10,000. I can take a year off and finish this game between 2007 and 2008, and then I can just give it out, and then it'll be done. Clearly not. 2008 rolls around, and in the process of redesigning their website, they put a donations button on their website, and as soon as they do that, people start donating money. People who've played Dwarf Fortress start donating money to Tarn, the only person at this point who's working on the game, to keep making the game and keep adding systems and to keep following his vision of what this game should be. And at various times, this sort of PayPal donation system between 2008 and 2015, it goes up and down. And at some points, it's like $500 a month. Some points, it's $10,000 a month, because as soon as he releases a patch to the game and people start telling more stories, and it gets out to the broader community that there's a new version with some weird thing like dangerous elephants or lava in the depths, or Balrogs under your fortress, or whatever it is, suddenly everybody will go, oh yes, Dwarf Fortress, I remember the Dwarf Fortress exists, and go back to it and go and download the most recent update, and then also go, well, I mean, he's worked so hard on this, it's so great, and I've just spent 30 hours playing this game, here, have $10. And so that rolls on for a bit, and obviously a bunch of internet stuff happens, and people come up with this mechanism, which is Patreon, and which is a way of crowdsourcing patrons who will keep paying you month on month to make the stuff that you make. If you're making something they value, then they'll keep giving you stuff. And to be honest, I don't think you get a huge amount extra from their Patreon. Some people feel that they have to produce additional stuff like creator talks and all of those kinds of things for a Patreon. But I think Tarn and now Zach, his brother, who were working on it for much of this period, do occasional Q&As and AMAs, but beyond that, they just kept making stuff and releasing a monthly schedule and delivering new updates to the game every month from 2015 to 2022. And people happily subscribed and funded them for a few dollars a month. And so they were earning, by the time they were doing the Patreon, they were earning $6,000 to $10,000 a month, every month, that supported their development. And that allowed them to do a whole bunch of things. One of the things was employ some people to do some additional programming, do some additional support, do some play testing, help them like hone the user experience so that it's easier to get on board with, maintain their community, but also they invested a bunch of this money in saying they were going to make a release version that was going to be commercially available, and getting all of the graphics end working so that they could do that. So when it released in Steam at the end of December 2022, beginning of January 2023, the creators made $7 million out of it, which was very nice and very heartening to see that people still love Dwarf Fortress, and even more people are playing it now, and people who can access it a bit better than trying to figure out what that ASCII hash, what a blue hash is. Oh yes, that's a unsown plot of farmland. So it's great, and I love the fact that they've done it. I don't think it's totally unique. I think certainly before Dwarf Fortress, The Sims does a bunch of these things. I think it's much smaller in scale. You're only dealing with 2 or 3, maybe 5 people living in a house. But if what you want is soap opera, The Sims is absolutely amazing and a really great experience. And all 4 versions have sold a hell of a lot more than 17 million copies each. So just to be clear, this is not a one-off. People love these kinds of things, these kinds of experiences where you're poking and prodding at the ant farm or the tiny telenovela that's unfolding, and getting the little characters to do stuff. RimWorld came out in 2013. Tynan Sylvester, another solo developer, made it. It's a sort of shrunk, slightly smaller scope version of Dwarf Fortress, but it's set in a weird, far-flung future. It's, I mean, I personally would say it's Warhammer 40k with the serial numbers rubbed off a bit. So there's a bunch of kind of royalty in the game, or noble houses, science fiction noble houses, a bit like Dune, a bit like 40k, all of those kinds of things. There's weird alien creatures. There's all kinds of stuff that, and you're dealing with a bunch of idiots who have fallen out of a spaceship and crash landed on a planet that at some point has been terraformed by beyond human intelligence level AIs for their own purpose, but also making it habitable for humans in kind of weird ways. And again, you also have pets. And you have alternatives to that, which is Prison Architect, Introversion Software make a whole bunch of these kinds of games where they're much more simulation-y. You don't care quite as much about the guards and the prisoners in Prison Architect, but I think you do see a lot more systems and a lot more moving parts, and I think it does a bunch of interesting stuff and generates stories. So there you go. That's me talking about Dwarf Fortress. So why do I think this is important? Why do I think Dwarf Fortress is something that's worth playing or thinking about? Why do I think that RimWorld and Sims and all of those are worth looking at and thinking about? I think human beings, as I said, make stories and see faces in the tiniest little things. These little tiny pawns, these little tiny bobblehead characters are human to me, right? I've spent a bunch of hours looking after these idiots who've crash landed on an alien planet and building up their little colony for a bit. And I was devastated when Exorius Hawk, otherwise known as Huntsman, who's just a troublemaker, who's annoyed everyone in the colony, accidentally got hit in the head in a firefight and ended up in a coma. And that's where I stopped playing that game, because I was like, I can't watch him just wither away and die, right? So these little troublemakers, for all they're just a little bunch of pixels, I care about them. And I care about them because I've stopped them getting in fights with each other. I've desperately tried to keep them alive. I've desperately tried to keep them fed, warm, or cool in the summer, and keep them occupied and look after them. And I think, you know, certainly Catherine Isbister sort of hits on this as this sort of weird dichotomy of playing games like The Sims, that they absolutely hook us in to caring about something other than ourselves, and hook us into sort of telling stories about them, because I think we absolutely care about these little creatures and give them life beyond themselves. Imagine that they're much more complex than they are, and often are sat there explaining to our partners that I just had to play for another half an hour because they were going to starve if I didn't do that. Anyway, so yeah, there's Huntsman lying there in bed. One day I'll go back to that save game and try and find the bit of really hard to get exo technology that might be able to restore him back to full health. Anyway, I think there's an important thing about Dwarf Fortress particularly, but I think it's true of all of these games, that there is a real powerful drive to succeed in games, but we don't feel like we're challenged unless we fail sometimes. And I think doubling down on that, I think Dwarf Fortress is really, really designed to be punishing. As you sort of get on top of the complexity of the systems, you get more and more difficult challenges piled on top of you. And you have to dig deeper, knowing that the deeper you dig underground to get the more powerful resources, to get the more powerful metals, is inevitably going to unleash your doom in a sort of Tolkien Balrog in Moria kind of way. And I think Jesper Juhl talks about this in his book, The Art of Failure, which is a book about designing good, challenging games. talks about this sort of dichotomy of wanting to fail, but also wanting to succeed. So I think having a game that allows you to fail, but fail in a way that you understand is important. And then finally, I think there is a beautiful, wonderful bliss that comes from seeing weird artworks that your dwarves have created. I think you can see in Dwarf Fortress particularly, and I think this is the core of why Dwarf Fortress is, why people write Dwarf Fortress stories, is that the dwarves carve their history onto the walls of the fortress. The designer, Tarn Adams, said, the original game idea was that I wanted to have 2 games. And one game was Dwarf Fortress, where the dwarves, you take the dwarves and help them build a community, build a colony, but something inevitably will destroy them. And the dwarves will record their history in the objects they make on the walls of their fortress and in the books that they make and the records they keep. But obviously, they don't write down what happens to them in the end. And I think players are compelled to carry on and tell that story, are compelled to go and tell those last few days of the fall of that dwarf fortress, because all the rest of it is recorded by the dwarves, but only you know what happened to the dwarves in the end. Only you, the player, know, and so you want to share it, just like the dwarves have recorded their history. So Tarn's idea was that it would record all of this history, and then there would be a second game where you play as a bunch of adventurers going into the monster-infested dwarf fortress and uncovering what happened to the dwarves, what their history was, that it was a place with all of this history. And there's a little bit, you can play the adventure, but it doesn't quite fulfill its end point. So maybe in 10 years' time, adventure will be as deep and complex as this. So I think these sort of artworks are really incredible, and you can see here this is RimWorld does the same thing, and you can see here that this is sort of talking about a moment that's happened in the game where the artist this piece illustrates Waldo Slick Mills sitting under a cherry tree with a happy looking happy smile. It's AI bullshit. So, you know, a group of burglars are awestruck by the scene. The work reminds the viewer of happiness. Rounding out the work, the scene takes place on the outskirts of a village. This depiction refers to Slick meditating on the 7th of August 5501. So this is like something that the game's recorded as happening, and then it's brought in a bunch of other stuff and sort of allowed somebody to create an artwork in game that records that moment in the game that the AI thought was important and illustrated it. And these games are littered with these sort of weird, sort of non sequitur AI written bits of story where it's sort of captured something happening and then it's tried to turn it into art. And I think it's wonderful. Obviously, I've allowed too many animals into my throne room, and you can see all the dirty footprints there. I haven't got a heart to put the mega sloth out. I like it hanging around my throne, and along with the guinea pigs. They all have to live inside, even though I've made a nice tiled floor for them. So yeah, I think characters that drive you to empathize but generate problems is really important. Complex systems that are understandable individually is important, but they have to generate complexity and slightly overload you with information so that when you miss one or screw one up, you attribute your failure to you not paying attention, not that the game's too complicated. And a system of the inhabitants making records and keeping them prompts the player to tell the story of the end of the dwarf fortress. I hope that encourages other people to play this and play similar games and look after some more of these little tiny idiots. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen now. Okay.
Awesome. So the timing is perfect. We have 10 more minutes. If anyone would like to ask any questions, JJ, do you want to start?
Yeah, hi. First of all, very interesting talk. So I've heard about a lot of these games like RimWorld, Dwarf Fortress, and I've been really interested in to play them. I was just thinking, like, talking about management games. A lot of the management games I like are like, you know, zoo management games like, you know, Jurassic World Evolution, Planet Zoo. And you know, I feel like very similar. I end up getting attached to like, you know, the animals and just like watching them, you know, act like animals. So I was just like kind of I wonder what your take on that is, like about, you know, empathy towards stuff that aren't even really human, are just basically animals.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I think that's one of the wonderful traits of our faulty construction, is that we put human attributes on all kinds of things. So it's lovely watching animals and think. I mean, I do it in the real world. So you know, I watch birds in my garden and go, oh, they're having a battle, they're doing this, they're doing that, right? And I think there's something quite. I think that the interesting thing about the zoo games and the theme park games is there's a sort of tranquility to it as well, that there's not the same, there's less of the same level of pressure. So sometimes you can just sit and watch it. And I think that's a powerful thing in its own right, and would be another thing to think about. Does that make sense? That sort of.
Yeah, it does, yeah, because I do agree with you. Like when I'm playing one of these, like, you know, zoo games, I do like just when I'm not building anything or whatever, and I just sort of sit back and just like watch one of the animals sort of go about, interact with the other animals or interact with its exhibit, and I just and it's just like something kind of zen to it. But yeah, that was very like insightful. Thank you.
Awesome. Helen, do you want to go next?
I will certainly try. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Penda. It was absolutely fascinating. Always love hearing you talk. There was a point where I was really, really worried for those dwarfs and those cats, but you brought it around. I just wanted to ask you, I was absolutely fascinated by what you were saying around the affordances of the games where the dwarfs are writing their own history, like the idea that you can arm them with tools to write their own history. I just thought that was really sort of fascinating, and the absolute complexity of the game environment to explore story. And I was also just thinking, you know, drawing from the last talk about sort of graphic fiction, about that sort of the spaces between visual storytelling, text, and how you fill the gaps. Like you described these tiny little pixels, but we're filling in the gaps and we're bringing empathy to it. So just wondered if you could say a bit more about how that kind of connectedness to story and that investment works in terms of how we position ourselves, you know, immerse ourselves in that kind of game story.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, you immediately made me think of Scott McCloud and his book Understanding Comics, because he sort of talks about that sort of idea of what happens in between the frames and how we fill stuff in, but also talks about sort of having less visually described main character means that you fill in for them as well. So I think there is a bit of that. I think there's also something about them having some autonomous behavior. And I think The Sims lacks a little bit of it, and it feels a bit more staged, that you sort of have to prod them. I was having a conversation based off of this about The Sims, in that The Sims, if you want them to be in a romance, you have to kind of poke them to initiate it. Whereas absolutely RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress, there is all kinds of complicated romance stuff going on, and people falling out, and people like chatting people up, and then other people getting angry, or the person who's being chatted up getting angry, which causes anxiety and problems amongst the little folks. So I think even just those stated lines of Waldo talked to Trevor about wanting more entertainment in the colony, those kinds of little one-line things just create this sort of thing that you then fill in and go, what was that conversation like? But the game has literally only done that. It's gone, there's not enough leisure activities. These two characters are next to each other talking to each other. But the system then generates something you hook into and take forward.
Thanks, Penda.
Henry, do you want to ask next?
I think Miss Crawley is for me. does she want to answer for me? I can go later.
Just ask your question, Henry.
Okay, all right, sure. Okay. Penda, I really like how you mentioned about empathy and the human nature of needing to do storytelling, even if the character is just a blob or pixel on screen. And you mentioned about Jesper Joe's art of failure, and I wanted to ask a question specifically about it. Do you feel like in Dwarf Fortress it exemplifies the duality of conflict, internal conflict and survival, or does it mitigate that we, the players, are not really God, and we can't really micromanage everything, and we should let how our dwarves deal with things according to the programming, as opposed to we, the player, dictate how a game wins or lose. It's actually outside our control. Or
I see what you mean. I think there's a bunch of stuff there, right? So I think Dwarf Fortress, the dwarves won't build a fortress on their own. You have to give them a bunch of orders. So it's not quite as simple as it might win or lose on its own. It does require the player to give some input. But I mean, there's something interesting there that if there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no win state for Dwarf Fortress. RimWorld, yes. RimWorld, you can win the game by getting your little colonists into a spaceship and flying off the planet. But I don't think I think I've done that once with a game of RimWorld, but I go back and play RimWorld again and again, even though that doesn't.
Sorry, yeah, I do know that Dwarf Fortress, I did play it once. Yeah, there's no game win and end game state. I know that. It's what I mean by this. Sorry, I didn't phrase my question correctly. I'll rephrase again. So what I want to ask is about the duality. Would you say that Dwarf Fortress is like how would you define? Would you say Dwarf Fortress is like Enigma that breaks apart the duality of conventional strategy games that always has to have a win and lose state, and a lot of strategy games, for example, Age of Mythology, treats you like a god, treats the player like a god. The player is the center of it, but Dwarf Fortress is actually, well, the occupants in the game are like somewhat self-aware, and it relies on the millions that plays the game somewhat for you. That's the interaction that makes the story. Would you say it's that? Like, I'm sorry, I'm asking very high concept, like a philosophical question about games. As
you always do, Henry. I think you raise an interesting point. I think there is something there. It's a different beast to a strategy game. But I think, yeah, maybe we can trash this out somewhere else.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Thank you. That answers my question.
Adam, do you want to go next? Adam? I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Yes, it's Adam. Hi, Penda. Firstly, I want to just say that was an amazing presentation. My question even is, through stories and stories in general is a much wider concept, but also in the way of how Sims and Dwarf Fortress kind of does a story. Through a game design perspective, how would, like, heavily unrealistic and, for lack of a better word, stupid stories, how would, as a designer, would you kind of allow the player through the design of the game to create whatever stories they want, as serious or unrealistic as they want to.
I mean, I think The Sims and Dwarf Fortress and RimWorld are really good examples of that. That even stuff like Prison Architect. I mean, clearly there is authored stuff structured around that. Somebody's deliberately keeping control of what actions are available. But within that frame, as long as there's silly possible interactions, there's potential for comedy, but there's also potential for tragedy, and comedy and tragedy aren't really ever that far apart, right? So I think as long as you've got characters that don't know everything about their world, but are trying to solve their own needs, then you're going to be but the player does. You've got essentially dramatic irony. And that dramatic irony then gives you the opportunity to create the dramatic irony that creates comedy, or the dramatic irony that creates tragedy. So I think having those three elements maybe would be a good starting point. And I think that's what works really well for video games, is having the player know more than the characters in the game, but also having the characters driven by their own needs and their own desires to do stupid stuff that the player maybe can hold them back from, or try to contain, or whatever, or allow to happen in the stupidest way possible.
Yeah. Thank you.
We're going to take our last question from Rafaela.
This is coming from someone who is actually in the education system herself, doing early childhood studies. Us teachers, we're against the idea of digital play in education, because we believe that children need to be outside. And I really dislike the digital world, because for kids as young as 13, even younger, or on Instagram, and they're getting exposed to like pornography, paedophilia at such a young age, and it can have an adverse effect on their mental health. So this is why us teachers are always like sending out letters, please ensure your child is old enough, they're age appropriate to be on Instagram and these games as well. There's children as young as 5 on Peggy 18 games. And I see it all the time. When I was working in mainstream school, primary school, I used to see kids like pretending to be like, to kill each other like they do on bloody Call of Duty. And I'm like, why would these parents allow their children to play such games like that when they know the privacy? This is what us teachers are always frustrated about. Why are parents so like, it sounds like they don't care really what their children play.
Sorry, was there a question there?
No, it's just like, because I'm from it's not really a question, it's just a statement, because I come from a different course.
Sure. And
we have different beliefs about digital play and the digital child. I'm more of a, rather than the children play games, they should be outside.
Well, it's a position.
I do want to get to everyone. However, the session did end 5 minutes ago, and we do have to get going on to the next one, unfortunately. But please, if you guys can, our next session is a sci-fi panel, and we have a lot of amazing authors that are lined up for this session. It will be starting in 5 minutes, and it's going to be about climate fiction, a very, very fascinating topic. And of course, the future of storytelling will be integrated in there. And I want to give a huge, huge, huge thank you to Penda. It was such an amazing talk. I had no idea any of this stuff, and it's really cool to hear about, really fascinating stuff. So yes, a huge round of applause. Thank you so much. And James, would you like to close off before we end?
Thanks, Lauren, Taryn, fantastic. Penda, as always, you smashed it. Metaphorically. Fantastic. Yeah. Thanks again, Penda. Yeah, as Lauren said, please head over. We're starting now, aren't we, with the sci-fi panel, which I've got here. I think is the new super popular subgenre of sci-fi. So I hope you agree that's unmissable. So we'll see you. We'll see you there. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Penda.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.